to the cloud. Great, thanks.
Transcription. Okay, so give me just one moment here. All right, so for today's lesson, we're basically going through a build of survey data. So extrapolating out that you could take any survey data from a Google survey to something very complex to put into Flow. And so the thing we're going to dive into is related to survey data that came about Chris Rock versus Will Smith and the controversy at the Oscars. And so this is like my very scrappy story that I was working on just a little bit ago, which is that, okay, so Will slapped Chris. Now suddenly we're all watching the Oscars and analyzing. And then I see headlines like this, that most Americans blame Chris Rock over Will Smith, which actually kind of was surprising. And then I later dug deeper, and there is this survey response that David Schroer from Bluerose Media published. And this is what most of the articles were based on, basically, and we can go into some of the percentages there. But it more or less was sort of a kind of a titillating story in some sense. It's showing that more people support Chris Rock, and that it's more younger people that support Chris Rock, and older people supports Will Smith. And so, anyways, so a few days later, ironically, someone from Veraisight reached out to us, and that is a company that conducts surveys as well. And they gave us access to their survey results. And that is essentially what we'll be plotting here today. So I'll just go through sort of what this looks like on a holistic scale here. I'll try to zoom in as much as I can here. Can people see that okay?
Yep. Yes, Michael. Yep.
Okay.
We can see it.
Great. So in this data, basically these date timestamps don't really matter. Now, what's interesting is how they worded the question was unique, or not unique, but important. So the way Bluerose Media asked the question was, who do you think was more in the wrong? So who do you blame for more was in the wrong? And Veraisight asked it a different way, which I pasted. Not there, sorry, I lost the question, or it would be in a notepad. Give me 1 second. That's okay. I'll find the site, but basically the net of the story is you have to look at the opposite of the question they asked in order to do the apples to apples comparison. So 1 second, need to log back in.
So is the observation from that it really depends a lot on how the question's asked as to what the responses are that's gonna drive.
Yes. That it's, yeah, great point. That you know, when sort of going through these the story, that it's easy to want to just do the one-to-one comparison, but you just have to be pretty careful when you go question by question. Yeah, so anyways, that is reflected in the data sets. And I'll put this into the chat window. It is a link to our demo media folder. And I just put a direct link into the Oscar controversy survey data. And basically these assets are sort of the things I was planning to use to start to build out the story. In addition, we actually created our own little survey that just compiled the two together so that we might be able to get a more definitive response, since the two conflicted with one another so much. So anyways, let's start to dive in a bit, and I'll start to show you sort of some of the ways we can visualize this, as well as organize the information. So one thing on the data side before I jump in, there are two fields that I added. One is called age bin. And what that is looking at is the age and putting it into a bin. And it's basically an if statement, more or less, to say if it's less than a certain number, put it in, or put this text in. And so this is helping to group them together. And so that's just one thing that has been done. In addition, there's another tip here for sorting alphabetically, that I can sort alphabetically just by adding a number to the front. So this way, this strongly disagree has a 1 in front of it, 2 for disagree, and then 3 for agree, and then 4 for strongly agree. And so that way, when we actually plot it, it's easier to sort a row. So that will make more sense when we see it. So I know I'm jumping kind of fast. Any questions so far? Otherwise, I'll start to dive in.
Yep.
Okay.
How many rows in the data set?
So I think it's like 1,900. Yeah, 1,958.
Okay.
So about 2,000 records.
Okay.
And to get to that, in that folder, if you want to follow along or for after, there's 2 files really to reference. I saved them as CSVs to make it a little easier. So one is the updated Veraisight survey results, and then the other is a real quick one I put together that is asking or showing the very first question of whose side do you support, basically. And so that's the one I'm going to start with, actually. And so I'll start there, and then let's start to build out the story. So I'm going to go into Flow, and this was one I was messing around with earlier. And we will click on Create Flow. So from here, we'll load in our data sets. So we could choose the Google spreadsheet directly. Actually, I'll do that in this case. Or we could load the CSV. Either works. Actually, I'll just stick with CSV for now, just to make it consistent with everybody. And then this is in. So that file or folder that I had shared, and I'll start with just this very first data set, which is Veraisight versus Bluerose CSV, 1 kilobyte. And if you wanted a smaller data set, I don't know if you could get any smaller than this one. It's literally 2 rows of data here. And all it is, let me refresh this real quick. So all this is the question, which side was wrong, and then for each, the different survey respondent or survey companies are noted in the org here. And so these are really percentages, but the thing I wanted to show you first is something that I think is very helpful for percentages in specifically. And it comes from sort of this more core concept that a dot is representative of a thing, that a dot is a person or a place or a thing, and that when you're moving it from step to step, it's not disappearing. It might transform or might move, but it's not disappearing. Whereas percentages somewhat obfuscate the total number. So if you can remember, I think, so Veraisight was 1,950 respondents, and Bluerose Media, I think, was around 2,000 respondents. And here we have the percentage. And so we could calculate essentially how to convert this into an actual number to show that number of respondents. And I think it's a very powerful mechanic. So let me just show you a little bit of it. So here we have the numbers 0.523 and 0.477. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to, instead of doing point per row, I'm going to do point per value. And so I'm going to tell it to look at Chris Rock for this one. And I realized I probably should have said it a little differently. Now I think about it. So give me That's right. Sorry, give me 1 second here. So we go back to, let me actually open up that CSV file. Yeah, actually, no, I can make it work with this. Never mind. What I was going to say is I should have probably put Chris Rock and Will Smith in the same column and just called that the like who. And then I could have done this a little differently in terms of how we structure the data, but this will be fine. So what this is looking at is the column Chris Rock. And right now it's doing a one-to-one relationship where 1 dot equals 1 value. But since it's a decimal that we have in there, we want at least 100s would get us to 50. And it looks like that's not working. Sorry, give 1 sec. Okay, I went the wrong direction. So instead of multiply by 1,000, I need to divide or multiply by 0.001, where I could go a little further to add more dots. But essentially what this is doing is helping convert that decimal into, or the percentage into a number of dots. So any questions on that? Does that make sense to people? I can elaborate a little bit more if that's helpful. So what I'm doing here is just showing the different orgs. And so I'm going to change the colors just a little bit. And just to make this kind of easy to see, if I go to categorize columns, I can look at the 2 different orgs next to each other for the exact same question. And this is for Chris. And as I'm going through this, I'm realizing that I needed to fix the underlying column, I think, but give me just a moment here. Okay, so what I'm doing here is duplicating the swarm because I realized that I need to basically show both Chris and Will as 2 separate swarms here, one next to each other. Otherwise, it's yeah, wouldn't quite work. So anyways, to the left is Chris and to the right is Will. And oh, that's interesting. So you can sort of start to see the numbers here. The magnitudes are not as easy as I expected to be able to discern sort of that first key metric. So let me take a step back here. And I appreciate, or I hope you guys are appreciating the fact that this is all very live with our absence. Okay, so I'm just going to update the basic CSV real quick to create a column called value and then who. So we have Chris. And so by doing this, we simplify the data set so that we can use point per value still, but that we don't have to create a different swarm just to show the same thing. And if you have questions about that, I'm happy to go into a bit more detail on what exactly is happening there. And let me make sure I save this in the right spot. Okay. All right, so close out of that. So let me sort of take one step back here and delete that swarm. All right, so let's swap out this data set. Yes, there we go. I want it to come from the column value. And here I'll start to put a scatter plot together. And on that scatter plots thing I want to do is on the height axis, I'm going to put the different org. And then this is where we're going to get into additional dimensions. And I'm not going to get too deep into it, but the area that we need to do is dispersion shapes. Now you can get to it as well from going to additional dimensions, and we have some like basic parameters here. The things we're going to really focus on are columns, stacks, and skyscrapers. Those are really the ones that help you separate dots when you're looking at point per value. Violin charts are also very applicable here. So if I do a violin, actually let me do, yeah, I can do the violin chart, that's fine. So the thing I want to color this based on is who. So let me start to do this a little differently here. So on the width axis, we are going to put the different org, and on the depth axis, we're going to put who they're supporting. And the thing we want to look at is basically these skyscrapers is the term that we've created for them. And if I add more points per row, I'll start to see them come down. And the thing I'm trying to emphasize here is that if I collapse this completely on the who column, you'll notice that these both go to the same height because this is a 0 to 100 scale. We have the same multiplier for point per value. And since we're showing everything in percentages, this will show 0 to 1 essentially. So it's a way that you can show a inner percentage essentially. Now the thing that's not in flow is to be able to get that percentage directly. That comes from the just like a pivot table or something like that. And I can go through how to run like a pivot table, but you can get to the percentages that way essentially to get to create it. So that's sort of step one to set up the scene of basically showing composite percentages, but that you can create new steps that you can put things on different dimensions. And so I show this because once you sort of master or play around with it quite a lot to really see things that you can start to, when you start to get into very large quantities of data, then this data really starts to come to life, and you can really start to see not only just basic metrics, but also, well, I guess it is pretty basic. It's basic histograms is mostly the thing that you're looking at with endpoint per value. Here's the age range, but here is the actual salary information. And so that's one sort of insight I think we've really gleaned is that the reason this is so interesting is because there's 47,000 dots and not just 100 dots. Because you could show the same thing as 100, right, or 1,000 dots, because you could just look at it as percentages. But there is something about the fact that each one of these dots is someone that responded to the survey that I think is meaningful and something we've sort of uncovered. So let me get back to this one. So this beginning is using point per value, which has its own merits. And what I'm going to do is create another swarm. And on this swarm, the data source is going to be the other file, which is Veraisight's, the updated Veraisight file. And so this is the raw data. And with that, let's start to look at it. So now we can actually see 2,000 respondents. And so let's first see which side they blame. And let's change the colors. In this case, let's do a color scheme of, I guess which side they support. Right? We're sticking with that theme. And so I'll change the color scheme. And on this, I'm going to go back into additional dimensions. I'll just select columns to start as an easy way to start. It goes way up there, so we need to come back down. And we can do that by increasing the number of dots per row. or we could also play with the spacing here. The points per row is how many wide it is. And then these alignment functions have to do with the left, right, center of the axis. And then you can center this on the axis to make something that's more of a violin chart, or you could put it on top, which is more of the bar charts, or you could actually put it on the bottom. And so they're actually really powerful components when you do this, because it's basically just stacking. Like if you think of each dot as a person, you're stacking it up like a child in some sense. That's a lot of what you're doing. And so it's just putting them into different piles. So here's basically the results. So on a macro scale, it's very easy to see that more people are blaming Will Smith versus Chris Rock. And now we can start to add some more dimensionality. So if I duplicate this step, on this step, let's go ahead and add some depth to this. So on this depth axis, maybe we can look at gender as one sort of case example. Now, the thing we care about is less this axis now, and we care more about the intra axis, the distinction here. And so one thing we could do is just get rid of the other dimension, actually, and we could just stack these together. You can't see it quite as well because of the ordering, and I can go over how we'd resolve that, but I'll keep them separate for now. And so here we're seeing somewhat of a slight difference, male to female, in terms of percentages that supports Chris, or if those that blame Chris, is less for men compared to females. It looks like and around the same number for that. And once we get the actual percentages and add that as text here, I think it will really start to resonate. Okay, so I know I'm going kind of fast and this is a little bit exploratory, but what questions do people have? And are there specific topics I could dive into further? And let me sort of pause there.
So Michael, I think I get it, but I just want to confirm with you. I've never seen the points per value being used this way, but this is really kind of providing insight. It basically, by setting the points per value as 0.0001, you're saying if in the CSV file the value is 1 or 100%, I'm showing 10,000 points, 10,000 dots.
Exactly.
Okay.
So you're in some ways you're converting from a decimal to back to the original respondent size. And for the long time, I was really struggling because I don't know if you could tell in the beginning, I'm not a huge fan of just the percentages in many ways, that it dumbs down the the complexity of how many people responded and a lot of other elements. And I think that's sort of been a realization we've made more recently in terms of what sort of a superpower flow is. And part of it is that each dot can be a person. So that's sort of a workaround to get there. So yeah, point per value is definitely an area to explore, definitely a little trickier. And you'll want to use basically the additional dimensions dispersion, which basically means if the dots on the exact same XYZ coordinate point do something. That's in simple terms sort of what's happening. We can go into more detail on how it operates.
Yeah, and this is Bill. We've actually gotten feedback from our customers on this topic. Like we've put up alternative steps as we're doing projects for customers, and we asked them, hey, which of these speaks better to you? And almost universally, the steps that have lots of dots on them, rather than the percentages, is what people resonate with. So there's something psychological going on here in users or audience members that say, hey, seeing something where each dot represents a personal response is just more meaningful than breaking them down into percentages.
Yeah, I think this is, you guys posted it on a short, I think it was maybe Jason wrote that about brain science, to talk about how this, if you look at this versus a the numbers or even the percentage bar charts, it is easier to, it's basically a less taxing on your brain. You don't have to translate to say, okay, what does that mean, the percent? This is, you can just say each dot is a person who responded, and it's just very straightforward.
Yeah. Yeah, and Richard does bring up a good point in terms of, do you always want to plot out all the people? And I think the thing I've noticed for maybe where percentages do work is when you have to show them there's a lot next to each other. So let me do one thing real quick. And I don't want to do this. Yeah. So if I take this same data set and let's just add one additional column in, which let's add in the dimension of gender. So for this one, so gender. Okay, and here, let me just go back to the pivot table. And this one, I want to look at gender. Okay. Oh, sorry. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have gone down this road with point for value for this specific sheet. I'm doing the wrong thing. I'm sorry. So please ignore my assessment there. But I'm trying to think of how to show you something that's that I can't show you because it's a enterprise project. But essentially, it's think of percentages sort of all next to each other where you're comparing different rows. And then you can see the percentage differences. I almost think of this as like stacking sand is a lot of what you're doing here. So anyways, that's a little bit of a summary. So let's see. What other questions were there? Standard deviation or variance. Yeah, no, you're pointing up a lot of really good points on the statsy side of things. And in many ways, what we're showing is sort of the rawest form of the data, which we found to be the most effective in terms of like creating these visualizations that are very intuitive to people. But yeah, a lot to still explore there. Maybe on this last step here, so we're looking at, one, we're looking at gender to split that out and seeing some differences. But let's, I think there is one that has pretty stark differences. And I think that one was the unacceptable. So there was a question in the survey that basically asked if it's under any circumstances is it okay to hit someone. And so I don't know if you noticed it there, but how this populated is not in order, just because it's how it shows up in the spreadsheet. So in order to get this in the right order, I'm sorting this alphabetically. And so that way we see these in the correct order. So and let me find the exact text for this question. So give me just one moment. That's a question. Is it ever acceptable to hit someone who verbally insults a partner or family member? So I'm just going to create that as text here in the scene, and I have that be over here. And so that's essentially, the beginning stages of starting to slice and dice this, where here on those that strongly agree that it's never acceptable, blame Will Smith far more than the opposite side for those that disagree with this statement. So kind of interesting to see that stark contrast percentage-wise. And I'm not going to say that these blocks here, maybe are fully doing it, but let me just quickly show one other way to do this that's a little more advanced, but I'm sort of going with it. So here what I'm doing is collapsing the width axis. So I'm no longer looking at Chris and Will. And what happens there is all these dots compile together and it looks like a random jumble. And that's because of the order of the data. So this is something that Sierra was going to dive into, is the idea of creating snapshots of the data. And so what we can do is sort, or there's a variety of things that you can do in terms of grouping and aggregating. But for this, I want to sort this by side or side blame. So just by clicking on this, it's going to sort it. And I'm going to create a snapshot. So snapshot 1 has been created. So now on this step, if I put it as snapshot 1, now you'll see that the colors are distinct, that you can see them relative to one another. So here you're seeing like the overall responses. So here you're looking at the percentages this way, and then within each column, there's a different breakdown of who's supporting who. So I think with labels and interactions, they can really start to come to life. But hopefully what you're experiencing here as well is that, scrubbing through the data to find the insight. I don't think flow is, there's a lot of things you can do there, but it's more about, how do you communicate some of those specific insights that are actually really difficult to communicate otherwise. So anyways, let me pause there, see what other questions you guys have, and happy to, dive into more detail.
Well, I'd like to say that I say this is a very brave experiment to do some original research, in real time, live, while you're trying to think. I mean,
this was a little too bold, perhaps, to try to train on something that I have not actually finished building yet, because most of builds, I think, are iteration, like you're testing things and seeing what works and what doesn't. But hopefully that's helpful if you guys are learning the system here for the first time. Seeing that process hopefully is insightful. I'm very bullish on when you have survey results, when you show each person, it does have a meaningful difference. Something we definitely noticed.
Yeah. So now, Michael, let's suppose we had 10 million responses, really big survey, where at some point does it become just difficult to, well, I guess what you could do then is you could say each dot represents 100 responses.
That's right.
Like that.
Yep.
So you could still have that concept rather than a percentages. You still have the concept, except that each bin or each dot would represent more than one response.
Yep. Exactly. And I haven't seen anyone do it yet, but technically what you could do is that for each one of these swarm dots, you can apply a texture. So that texture is, I think is underneath advanced. So this is under the 3 dots, the advanced UI. You'll see then a section called image shape. And you can load in an image file, which you'll want to be very small, that will basically take over the dots and put in something else. Now in our demo media folder, we have a few assets that you can choose from, like this one that looks like a coin, or like this.
You're not sharing your screen right now.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. Let me go back. So in our demo media folder, we have a few textures for dots that you can select from. So like we can load in a cube here. So that's, instead of seeing dots, now you see cubes stacked, or anything else. And so, so yeah, I was curious if I'd ever find someone that loads a texture that is basically like 100 dots. So then each dot is 100 dots, and then if you can still load 100 of the 100 dots. So it's sort of a trick to get more performance out of it. Yeah, so that's one thing I haven't seen yet, but yeah, it's definitely feasible.
So you could have a tiny little image file that had 100 on it to represent 100 units. I mean, you could do something like that, or a K to represent 1,000 units.
Yeah, that would work. Could definitely work. Yeah, and I mean, even on this point, one of the first slices that you can start to take as well is something called hierarchies, which we're not going to dive into, but a lot of what I'm showing here, you can essentially create yourself using hierarchies, where it adds it up for you for each of the categories. And I know that probably didn't make sense what I just showed yet, but I can show it more once I have this all together. But yeah, I really appreciate you guys all taking the time to come today. I apologize that we had to sort of scramble here to find a new topic, but hopefully it was helpful to see some of this get built live, and we'll actually, I'll try to be finishing this and publish something soon, so you can see sort of end to end what it looks like.
And this is very good timing because your screen just froze.
I see that as well.
Yeah. So let's see. Why don't we just open it up for if there are any other questions? We're kind of at the end of the session, but it seems like half these sessions go an extra 10 minutes or whatever, just because people have questions. Anybody out there in the audience have any questions? Okay, well, I guess we'll call it a wrap then on this session. Hey, thanks everybody for coming and watching a master flow designer work in real time in defining a problem and crafting a solution.
Thanks, Bill. I appreciate the hype. Yeah, thanks everybody. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Okay, hey, we'll see you again soon. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.